Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, Incorporating Your Startup in Canada. Thank you for waiting this first few minutes. We have, resolving some technical issues. Right now, we have our two guests joining us today. We have two lawyers. One immigration lawyer and the other one that works actually with corporations and all the things to have your own business here in Canada. So let's welcome to Peter Karayanis and Rene Verospi. They both are going to be talking with us today, and we are going to start having a few questions, about how to incorporate and how to immigrate here to Canada. And now, before we start, please make sure you send us the questions through contact@latamstartups.biz or to the hashtag LatamStartups. Thank you so much again for attending. And our first question actually goes to Peter. And we'd like to know, Peter, how is it to incorporate in Canada and how is the process?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank LATAM Startups for inviting me to participate. I'd like to say hello to everybody, and I'd like to say I'm very pleased to participate in the webinar. Incorporating in Canada, this is a question we get all the time. It's not very complicated, although there are some details. The process itself can be done almost on the same day, depending on whether or not you have all the information you need. What you're going to have to decide is what kind of corporation you want to operate, where that corporation is going to operate, and then you're going to have to make decisions about your business, how many shareholders, whether or not you're going to need a shareholders agreement, and things like that, which are separate from the incorporation process. But to answer your question directly, incorporation in Canada is very simple. It can usually be done in the same day. The cost of incorporation for a simple, what we like to say, a plain vanilla company is just a few $100s plus disbursements.
That's awesome, Peter. Thank you so much. Our next question then will be, to incorporate in Canada, you need to be actually a permanent resident or a citizen to have a corporation here in Canada, Peter?
No, you don't have to be. The shareholders do not need to be citizens or permanent residents of the corporation of Canada in order to incorporate. There is a requirement both for the Canadian companies and the provincial companies. That's a detail we can get into later, but you can incorporate under each of the provinces have a statute for incorporation as well as the federal government, but they do require that you have a resident Canadian, at least one resident Canadian, as a director of the company. So no, you do not need to be a Canadian citizen to incorporate a company, and you don't need to be a permanent resident to incorporate a company, but you will have to have at least one resident of Canada as a director.
Okay, sounds good. Now, what are the advantages for you, in your perspective, to incorporate here in Canada versus in US, for example? Why a Latin American startup will see that advantage here in Canada?
Okay, well, that's also a good question. I would say before I answer the question that we're not able to provide any US advice around this, but speaking more generally, I think what a Latin American startup may find is that we have a very pro-business, business-friendly environment in Canada. A lot of the transparency that startups look for, the ability to start their business, build their business, grow their business, they're going to find that in an environment like Canada. Obviously, there are very strong trade relations north and south between Canada and Latin America, and that would help to expedite it. We have, for instance, trade agreements with various countries in Latin America. I think these are some of the basic things. Obviously, everybody is going to have to make up their own mind as to what works best for them. The interesting strategic decision, though, is it's not really either or, because Latin American startups could come to Canada. Let's say, by way of an example, you could start to incorporate a company and operate out of Toronto, and then use Toronto as your base of operations as you then go to work into the communities in the United States. So it's not an either-or decision. It's really something that you can do either one and the other.
That's right. Thank you so much for that answer, Peter. So now for the next questions, this one goes to actually to Renee, and we'd like to know if there is anything, there are different types of visas here to come to Canada, and now from the startup's perspective, what is the best way to apply for a visa to come to Canada?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, Miriam, for Latin American startups. And well, regarding that that question, we have different options for entrepreneurs. We have to make a difference between investor and entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are more in the early stage of the develop of the business. There is one visa that is very popular, or the government has promoted. But the effects of that, there is not too many people applying through the last 2 years that we have this kind of visa, is the visa startup. And that involves some other organizations, designated organizations as venture capital, angel investors, and incubators or accelerators. And so far has been bringing people to Canada, but these people have to secure some funds from these organizations and pass the process, the permanent resident process, in order to become a permanent resident. This type of visa will allow people outside of Canada to come as a permanent resident. There are other type of visas, for example, work permits, that can create, for example, a significant benefit to the Canadian society. That is a little bit more complex, but that's also another option if people wants to come as a do a business in Canada. But the entrepreneurship part, it's limited for visas. We just have a small amount of visas for people who wants to create business in Canada.
Okay, Renee, could you please repeat the last, because the connection is good enough?
Which part exactly? Would the visa startup? Okay, so
could you please repeat the last part, because the connection is good enough, and yeah.
No problem. So what I was saying is that the government released in 2013 a specific visa for startups, that it's the Visa Startup. The Visa Startup works with joint organizations, designated organizations. People apply, giving them business plans, apply through these organizations first, as a first step, and after the idea, it's giving that the way to go, or they like the idea, they will issue a letter for support of an investment of $200,000 in the case of investors, venture capital investors, and in the case of angel investors, $75,000. With this letter of support, people can apply for the permanent residence in Canada. It's a two-steps process. There is another type of visas that people can apply for. These type of visas are work permits. They are not going to give them permanent residence in Canada. These work permits, it's very complex, and it's called entrepreneurship with a significant benefit for Canadian society. But there is still some options to apply through that process, yes, to come to Canada.
Thank you, Renee. Still, the connection is going, not really good. I will ask you to please put your volume a little bit low, so every time that you speak, it's not going to have to speak. But I have another question for you. So, is the same process to apply for a visa to go to any kind of city in Canada?
Basically, the federal part, if you apply through the federal government, that will allow you to move everywhere. Some provinces have specific regulations to immigrate, and some provinces have, for example, entrepreneurship streams. Right now, British Columbia has one. Now, Manitoba has also one. Programs for entrepreneurs and also for investors. But if you apply through the federal government, you can move to any part of Canada.
Okay. Well, we are going to have to repeat that part in some point, Rene. Let's try something. Let's try to turn off the video so we can get probably a better sound from internet because it's really good enough.
Oh, wow.
But okay, we are going to continue with the next question. And this one is for Peter. And how much, you mentioned that the cost to incorporate in Canada was around $200. Is there any other cost associated with incorporating in Canada more than, to create the company legally for these startups? Peter, do you hear me? Do you have mute your microphone?
Yeah.
So.
Hello. Can you hear me now? Yes. So thank you for that. I just muted my phone while Rene was giving his answer. Which, by the way, I should say, Rene, I can hear Rene's answers perfectly well. They're coming to me very clearly.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good.
So on the incorporation, I'll give you an example of an Ontario incorporation. I believe the cost, you have to pay filing fees to the government as well as legal fees for the incorporation. The filing fees to the government are not that expensive. I think the last time I checked is $375 or $380, which we pay to the province of Ontario for the incorporation. We may have to also pay some fees for the name registration. So it depends on what you have in mind. If you have a numbered company in mind, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Ontario Incorporated, then there's no costs associated with obtaining that name. If, on the other hand, you wish to use a name for your company, there may be some costs. We do have to do a name search. The name search costs $75. And then, assuming that there are no names that are too close to the name that you have in mind, then we'll be able to proceed. If, on the other hand, your name is very close to the name that your name is close to another name that we find in Ontario or operating somewhere in Canada, then we may have to decide how we're going to proceed on that basis. The legal fees around incorporation usually can be fixed at a fairly low amount. Again, this assumes that it's a simple company. I would tell people that if you're talking about a simple company that doesn't have a complicated share structure, perhaps only a few shareholders, a few directors, if you're paying more than, say, $200 to $500 in legal fees for the incorporation, you're paying too much. Now, if your company is a little more sophisticated and a little more complicated, so by way of an example, perhaps your company in Canada will be a wholly owned subsidiary of a company that's incorporated in Colombia or Peru or another Latin American country, and you may have some particular concerns around how you're going to structure the company. Well, that might be a little bit more complicated and may incur some additional fees. But for a simple company, in terms of all the disbursements, all the filing fees, and all of the legal fees, you should be, let's say, between $1,000 and $1,500 all in for everything. But that also raises then the question of trademarks, which is something that some people may want to talk about at some point.
Sounds good. Thank you, Peter. Now, Renee. So I think I was skipping one question here, that it was about the processing time to actually apply for a visa. So giving at least three examples of the different kind of visas startups can get and how long it will take the processing time for them. Could you please explain us something about that?
Yes, sure. So basically, everything depends of the type of application that you are doing. If you are doing, for example, a permanent resident application to immigrate to Canada, we are talking around a processing times between 1.5 years to 2 years. If you are talking about temporarily permits to come to Canada, for example, as a work permit, that also can be between four months to 6 months, depending on the overall process of what type of visa you decide to choose. Mm-hmm.
Sounds good. So now the next question is more about, what is your personal perspective about startup coming up here? What is your best advice for startups coming up here to Canada? Let's start with Peter.
There, I just had to unmute my signal there. Can you hear me now? Yes. My best advice is to come as quickly as possible. Canada is a great place for startups. We have a very vibrant community across the country, regardless of where you may choose to operate, whether it's Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver or other tech startup business areas like the Kitchener-Waterloo region. What I think is probably most important about that, though, is that you have a plan. And the plan is going to require that you speak with a few different advisors. Your legal counsel will be one in terms of incorporating and structuring the company or immigration as you plan it out. You're also going to want to have spoken to tax advisors and tax counsel in both countries. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be very complicated or very expensive. It just means that you have to have given some thought to this in advance. The reason for that is that while it's very easy to buy a ticket on an airplane and fly here and land and start to meet people, and the opportunity to do business you'll find is a very welcoming environment, you want to make sure that you plan the business out so that the chances to make mistakes or missteps or things like that are minimal. You want your business to have the greatest chance for success as early as possible, and so a little bit of planning in advance is probably what I would say is the best advice.
Well, thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, actually, my
Rene,
advice,
your best advice for those startups that are.
yes, my best advice is always to trying to look for the perfect way. The perfect way is not the same for everyone. You must have advice regarding what is the best options, and maybe for a person who already have contacts in Canada, a work permit will be ideally to come here. There is also, if you have been contacting some organizations and they think that your idea is attractive and you probably can secure the fundings, there is an option to apply through the permanent resident. The government released last year a special work permit for the startup visa program, so you don't need to wait basically 2 years to finalize your permanent resident. Your idea has to be supported, and with that letter of support from these designated organizations, you can come with a work permit right away. So there is a lot of things that we need to evaluate depending on the stage of the business that you are looking to do. Mm-hmm.
Sounds good, Rene. So right now, our last question about what you guys are doing is we'd like to know how your own organizations are helping startups to come here, either through immigration processes or to incorporation. So let's start with Rene this time. How is your organization helping startups to come here to Canada?
Yes, basically, thank you. What we do is provide advice. We work with business developers too. I actually work with someone in the way that we have to create the business plans in the way these designated organizations would like to see the business idea. That's for the part of the business developer. And in my part, I provide legal representation through the entire process. For example, if a work permit to come to Canada right away is required, I get in charge of that, and also through the process to applying through permanent residence. If the people wants to also check any other alternatives to come to Canada, I also provide legal representation to choose the correct way to bring them to Canada, if that's the idea, and contact them also with different legal services providers, depending on the specific needs.
And in my case, if I can answer the question from our point of view, so Conduit Law.
Okay. Peter?
Yes.
Yes.
Conduit Law has been working with startups since we started, and in some respects, some people refer to us as a startup law firm, although we've been established for a few years. But we work broadly with new companies in order to get them incorporated, get them set up, deal with shareholders agreement, deal with trademark issues, licensing, and the like. More recently, though, and this is just very new news, a week and a half ago, we affiliated with Deloitte, and now our law firm is known as Deloitte Conduit Law. And so now we have a broader capability to deliver a number of services to those individuals looking to start up their enterprise or bring their enterprise to Canada.
Sounds perfect. And actually, you know, Conduit Law has some exciting news just last week, right? When you guys are putting together just one big company, so that's good. Congratulations, Peter, for that too. And,
thank you very much.
Well, now we are going to continue with some questions from the public. So right now we have given you some information about how to incorporate here in Canada and what is the advantage to come here in general perspective. If you have any questions, please forward those questions to contact@latamstartups.biz and through the hashtag LatamStartups if you are in Twitter. Right now, actually, we have two questions that were forwarded at the beginning of this day today, and one actually is from Andres in Colombia, and he's asking how much will cost incorporate in Canada, and it will be, well, that question was actually answered, but it will be difficult to have a branch of my own company in Canada. He wants to keep his company in Colombia and have a branch in Canada. How much will cost that part?
Well, so having a branch, my answer to that question is you're going to have to decide whether or not you want to have just a branch. In other words, your company is somehow registered in Canada and operating, or whether or not you want to have a local Canadian subsidiary that is, say, wholly owned subsidiary of your company. I think that's a really important question. It's an important threshold question, and it's an important question for your tax advisors. I'm not able to provide tax advice, and a lot of whether or not you're operating a branch or a local subsidiary is going to be around what's the best situation for tax purposes. What I will say, though, is that in terms of day-to-day functioning of your business, in some respects, it will be easier if you have a locally incorporated company. And what I mean by that is just the day-to-day administrative details of setting up internet, setting up telephone, setting up an office, opening up a bank account. Local landlords, local banks, local telephone companies, they'll all be very, very familiar with working with Canadian companies. They'll be very, very familiar with working with Canadian startup companies. They won't have peculiar or special or unique questions for that. If, on the other hand, you're operating a branch and they're contracting with the Colombian company, you may very well have to answer questions of how do we deal with the company, who do we contact at the company, how are we communicating with the company, where is your local operation, who is your representative. So that's what I would say are factors to consider.
Thank you, Peter. The other question I think is, well, it's more related also with immigration, and here is Alejandra in Mexico, and she's asking if there is any advantage for startups to go and incorporate in Canada and immigrate in Canada, being Mexico as part of the NAFTA. So is there any advantage because Mexico is part of the NAFTA, or this part of immigration and incorporation is actually, in general terms, the same for all countries? Rene, probably, do you know?
Sorry. The NAFTA will give you the possibilities to do business with Canada. It's true. You have to follow the rules for incorporation here in Ontario, in Canada too. But the immigration process has specific categories. Even though you can do business between countries, and especially because of the NAFTA, the categories to immigrate are very specific. So you need to comply with the categories that we currently have. And that's part of the evaluation. If there is a category that you can fit correctly, if you want to put your start up your own business, the NAFTA agreement allows more mobility from workers or professionals. That is a little bit out of the topic, but it's important for people to know that. That free trade agreement have the possibility to, if you have the career in the list and an employer in Canada, you will have the possibility to come and work if you have a job offer. To do business it's also a good possibility, but that will give you temporarily permits and no permanent residence in Canada. So we have a few options for people depending of what they want to do, if they want to immigrate permanent or they want to be temporarily in Canada.
Perfect. Any other comments regarding NAFTA? Okay, sounds good. So basically, those were the two questions that we have right now. And because, we have always questions after the webinar, and normally for people that are, watching through YouTube, they have questions after. We would like to know how they can contact you directly, or if they can contact you directly to ask those questions that they may have about immigration and incorporation in Canada. Peter, you can start if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Most certainly, I'd be pleased to speak with anybody on that subject. I will let LATAM Startup circulate my email address. It's a little long to talk about on a webinar, but it's pcarianas@deloittelegal.ca. The spelling will circulate. We're based in Toronto, but we're most certainly available to speak with anybody who may be interested in coming to Canada. There's, each situation will be a little bit unique, and each set of circumstances will require some careful attention. But what I can say is that we have a very vibrant startup community here, and we have a lot of capacity to answer your questions and be of assistance. So we look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully we'll be welcoming you here in Canada.
Thank you. Rene?
Oh yes, thank you, Miriam. You are also feel free, please, to circulate my email and my contact information. I normally schedule meetings with people outside of Canada. People who wants to immigrate to Canada, and I have Skype conversations and also Viber, WhatsApp conversations, everything. The technology helps for people who is outside. So if they want to contact me and talk to me, I will be more than happy to talk and try to analyze their own situation.
Well, thank you so much both for joining us today in this webinar and for answering the questions about immigration and incorporation. Please remember that this year we have our annual conference in Mexico. It's actually in October. So we hope to see all those startups that are scaling new markets there. We're going to have great speakers and some great connections from Canada. We have a great community here. So I hope, personally to see you there. Thank you again for everything, and any questions, you can send us through contact@latamstartup.biz or through the hashtag LatamStartups. Thank you so much.